What happens when four anomalous intellectuals, misfits by nature, and armed with instruments that, in their hands, sounded more like tools of inquisition than of entertainment, decide that rock music needs a colossal dose of existential chaos, psychological terror, and a complete heretical absence of guitars? The answer, my friends, goes by the name of Van der Graaf generator, the musical entity that never asked to be loved, but that demanded, by the sheer force of its own uncompromising genius, to be unforgettable. And if today we celebrate them as the architects of one of the most singular and challenging sounds in history, we must first dive into the shadows they worked so hard to cast, not only in their lyrics but in their own turbulent trajectory. What would they hate for us to know? Absolutely everything that makes them human. Their flaws, their insecurities, their petty squabbles, and, above all, the paralyzing fear that deep down they were just another rock band in a world already overflowing with them. They were a schism, a theological anomaly in the gospel of rock and roll, and their story is a testament to the price one pays for refusing to take communion. To dissect the sacred and profane carcass of Van der Graaf generator, it is imperative, first and foremost, to understand the central figure, the dynamo and walking short circuit of the band, Peter Hamel. A man whose restless mind seemed like a library on fire, obsessed with setting to music the darkest pages of Sartre, Camus, Philip K. Dick, and Lovecraft. Hamel was not a vocalist in the traditional sense. He was a Shakespearean actor on an asylum stage, an apocalyptic prophet declaiming to a congregation of one, an inquisitor who turned the torch upon his own face. His vocal delivery, a seismograph of the human soul that shifted from a fragile, broken whisper to a gut-wrenching operatic scream of despair, was not for everyone. In fact, it was for almost no one. And therein lies the first inconvenient secret, the first truth the band would prefer to keep hidden under the Persian rugs of their complex arrangements. They were, from their inception, intrinsically elitist, not out of arrogance or affectation, but out of existential necessity. Their music was a private club, and the password was a willingness to be confronted, to feel the discomfort of dissonance and the vertigo of the most brutal introspection. They didn't want to please the masses. The idea of a stadium singing their hymns about internal assassins, the collapse of communication, and mad lighthouse keepers in unison, would have been, to them, the greatest and most vulgar of offenses. The band's very lineup was a declaration of war against the conventions of rock. Founded in 1967 in the intellectually feverish atmosphere of Manchester University, the band went through several incarnations before stabilizing into the lineup that would become legendary. Hamel, organist Hugh Banton, drummer Guy Evans, and saxophonist David Jackson. The deliberate absence of a lead guitarist, in an era dominated by six-string gods like Clapton, Page, and Hendrix, was not a mere whim, but a philosophical decision, an act of musical iconoclasm. They had no need for the clichés of blues rock, the predictable structure of riff, verse, chorus, solo. The guitar, with its phallic connotation, its tendency toward stardom, and its already exhausted language, was surgically removed and replaced by a sonic arsenal far more dangerous and unpredictable. In its place rose the gothic and profane cathedral of Hugh Banton's organ. Banton, a classically trained former BBC engineer, did not just play. He built and deconstructed his sound. He modified his own instruments, creating a wall of sound that was at once majestic and terrifying, capable of evoking both the solemnity of a Bach mass and the industrial clang of an abandoned factory. His bass pedals, played with his feet, did not merely provide the rhythmic foundation. They were a controlled earthquake, a seismic shock that made the ground tremble beneath the listener's feet. Add to this monumental architecture the drumming of Guy Evans. Evans was not a rock drummer. He was a polyrhythmist, a percussionist whose approach drew as much from jazz as from tribal rituals. His drumming didn't mark time. It commented on it, contested it, creating a constant tension, a sense that the structure could collapse at any moment. And to complete this quartet of horsemen of the apocalypse, there was David Jackson and his saxophones. Jackson, as he was known, was the agent of chaos. He often played two saxophones, an alto and a tenor, simultaneously, creating dissonant harmonies and schizophrenic textures that sounded like the screams of the soul. His sound was not the sensual saxophone of jazz or R&B. It was a weapon, a sonic gust of wind that tore through the sonic tapestry woven by Banton and Evans. This combination, the organ as both orchestra and inferno, the drums as both pulse and convulsion, and the saxophones as the voice of insanity, not only filled the space left by the guitar but devoured it, creating a vacuum in which Hamill's voice could reign supreme in its despair and fury. What they would hate for us to know is that this classic and seemingly cohesive lineup was, in reality, a powder keg of egos, neuroses, and conflicting worldviews. Peter Hamill, as the principal lyricist and composer, was the dominant force, the gravitational center around which everything orbited. Although interviews from the era paint a picture of democratic collaboration in the arrangements, an image of four intellectuals working in unison, the truth told between the lines of later accounts is that Hamill's vision was law. The band was the vehicle for his lyrical and existential explorations. The first album, The Aerosol Gray Machine from 1969, is the ultimate proof of this dynamic. It wasn't even supposed to be a Van der Graaf generator record. It was recorded as a Hamill solo album and was only released under the band's name to fulfill a contractual obligation with Mercury Records, which had signed him as a solo artist. The other members played as session musicians. This primordial tension between Hamill's solo project and the band's collective identity would be a wound that would never fully heal, a ghost that would haunt all their incarnations, fueling silent resentments that would surface in moments of greatest pressure. Commercial pressures, or the glaring lack thereof, were another constant point of friction. The band signed with the charismatic and audacious Charisma Records, home to other misfits like Genesis. The label's founder, Tony Stratton Smith, was a visionary who loved the band's artistic integrity, but realistically had no idea how to sell them. While Peter Gabriel's Genesis wove fairy tales and Yes built cosmic soundscapes, Van der Graaf Generator dragged the listener into the dark basement of the human psyche. There was no escapism in their music, only confrontation. The result was a resounding commercial failure in their home market, the UK, and in the United States. They were too complex for the traditional rock audience, and too dark, visceral, and aggressive for the fans of symphonic fairy tales. They were pariahs in the very movement they helped to define. Success, when it finally came, was geographical, bizarre, and ultimately destructive. Italy. For reasons that defy logic and that music sociologists still debate, the Italians embraced the existential angst, operatic theatricality, and intellectual complexity of VGGG. The album Pawn Hearts, the 1971, an uncompromising masterpiece featuring the 23-minute suite, A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers, a sonic collage about isolation and madness, became an unlikely phenomenon on the peninsula, topping the charts for 12 weeks. Suddenly, the four British outcasts were rock stars in Italy, with the status of gods. This adoration, however, came at a very high price. The Italian tours became exhausting and dangerous exercises in mass hysteria. The intensity of the shows, already legendary, was amplified by the fanatical and, at times, violent devotion of the audience. The band found itself trapped in an endless cycle of travel, chaotic shows, and the pressure of being the center of attention. David Jackson once complained that he couldn't walk the streets without being mobbed, a situation unthinkable in London. What should have been the validation of their work became a gilded cage, a hell paved with good intentions and Italian lyre. The machine they had created was now consuming them. And here lies another truth that the band would prefer to keep buried in the dusty annals of rock history. The first major breakup in 1972, at the absolute peak of their creative power and continental fame, was not a mutual and considered artistic decision, a strategic move to explore new horizons. It was an act of pure exhaustion, self-mutilation, and despair. Hamill, feeling the crushing weight of leadership, the repetition of a vicious cycle of recording and touring, and seeing the group's sanity slipping away, simply pulled the plug. There was no grand meeting, no melancholy handshake for the press. The band simply ceased to exist, imploding under the weight of its own unexpected success. Nick Potter, the bassist who played on the seminal "The Least We Can Do Is Wave to Each Other," and "H to He Who Am the Only One," had abandoned ship even earlier, genuinely frightened by what he described as an aura of malevolence he felt around the group. This dark energy was not just a stage persona to shock the audience. It was a reflection of the internal tensions, the intellectual competition, and the psychological pressure they exerted on one another. The music was an exorcism, and the exorcism was killing them. Hamill retreated into a prolific solo career, which in truth had never stopped, and the other members went their separate ways. It seemed like the definitive end, but the gravity of their musical chemistry was too strong. In 1975, they reunited, not with a grand plan for world domination, but almost by chance, for a jam session that ended up becoming the basis for a new album. The world was different, and so were they. The trilogy of albums that followed, God Bluff 1975, Still Life 1976, and World Record 1976, is considered by many to be not just their zenith, but one of the most fiercely creative periods of any band of that decade. The sound was leaner, more direct, more aggressive. The fat had been trimmed, leaving only muscle, bone, and exposed nerves. It was as if they had anticipated the rawness and anger of the punk movement that was about to explode. It is no wonder that Johnny Rotten, the future icon of the Sex Pistols, was an avowed fan, having even played VDGG on his Capitol radio show. This admiration attests to how far they were from the progressive rock establishment, with its fantasy cover art and escapist lyrics that punk came to destroy. Van der Graaf Generator was the antithesis of pompous prog. They were the prog punks before the term even existed, the street-level intellectuals who read Nietzsche instead of Tolkien. But again, stability was an illusion, a mirage in the desert of life on the road. The touring machine, though less chaotic than in Italy, was still relentless. And the financial realities of being a cult band, even one acclaimed by critics, began to take their toll. Hugh Banton, the sonic architect, the man whose vision shaped the band's sound as much as Hamill's words, was the first to leave the ship in 1976. His departure was a devastating blow, but the reasons were painfully mundane and human. Tired of life on the road, the financial uncertainties, and with a family to support, he traded the rock stages to dedicate himself to building and installing electronic organs for churches, a career he maintains to this day. It was a pragmatic decision that, deep down, revealed just how unsustainable the existence of Van der Graaf Generator was as a viable enterprise. Shortly thereafter, it was David Jackson's turn to leave, worn down by the same routine. The band, in an act of either stubbornness or courage, carried on, recruiting bassist Nick Potter back and adding violinist Graham Smith. They shortened the name to simply Van der Graaf, a tacit acknowledgement that the original entity was dead. They released a powerful album, The Quiet Zone, The Pleasure Dome. But the magic, the volatile and dangerous chemistry of the classic lineup, had dissipated. In 1978, they split up again. Decades passed, the legend grew. A new generation discovered their music, recognizing in it an honesty and an intensity that was lacking in much of contemporary rock. And then, in 2005, the unthinkable happened. The classic lineup reunited for a show at the Royal Festival Hall in London. The event was a triumph. The chemistry was intact. The fury and passion still burned. The reunion spawned a new double album, Present, and a tour that celebrated the return of one of history's most unique bands. But the story of Van der Graaf Generator is cyclical, and the old fissures, never fully healed, were bound to reopen. And here we arrive at the most painful chapter, the one they would surely wish to erase from the official history. After the success of the reunion, David Jackson was summarily dismissed from the band. There was no friendly farewell, no joint statement about creative differences. It was an amputation, swift and brutal. The official reasons given by Hamill in one of his online newsletters were vague, speaking of difficulties in understanding and confrontations with the other members. He was blunt, stating that Jackson seemed to find it difficult to grasp what we had mutually agreed. Sources close to the band and later statements from Jackson himself paint a more complex picture. suggesting he was unwilling to commit 100% to the band's touring schedule, prioritizing his work in music therapy for children with disabilities, a calling he considered more important. Whatever the real reason, the dismissal of a figure so integral and defining to the band's sound, and in such a cold and corporate manner, stained what should have been a glorious return, revealed that, even after decades of maturity and experience, the old power dynamics and communication difficulties were still there, ready to erupt at the slightest sign of pressure. The band carried on bravely, as a trio, proving that, in the end, the indestructible core was always the trinity of Hamill, Banton, and Evans. They released excellent albums as a trio, but the sound, inevitably, was never the same without the wild breath, the unpredictable scream, and the chaotic soul of Jackson. What Van der Graaf generator would truly hate for us to know ultimately is that behind the facade of intellectual complexity, hermetic poetry, and the posturing of uncompromising outsiders, they yearned for recognition, albeit on their own strict terms. They paid the highest price for their artistic integrity, never achieving the commercial success or financial stability of their contemporaries. This generated a ballast of resentment and hardship that corroded the band's foundation at crucial moments. They were an anomaly, a band that didn't fit on any record store shelf, too cruel and visceral for progressive rock, too excessive and intellectual for the punks. This uniqueness was their greatest strength and their greatest, most tragic curse. They created their own musical universe, dark, dangerous, and fascinating, but one into which few dared to enter, and even fewer could inhabit for long, including themselves. The untold story of Van der Graaf Generator is not about drugs, groupies, or the cliché excesses of rock and roll. It is a much more subtle and, perhaps for that reason, more uncomfortable and universal story. It is about the brutal difficulty of reconciling a relentless artistic vision with the pragmatic and often sordid realities of the music industry. It is about the constant friction between a singular genius and the legitimate desire of his collaborators to also leave their mark, to be more than mere instruments of another's vision. It is about the paradox of being acclaimed as pioneers while struggling to pay the monthly bills. They gave us Pawn Hearts, God Bluff, and a discography that continues to challenge, to frighten, and to inspire. But in the process, they sacrificed friendships, stability, and perhaps a piece of their own sanity. And that, my friends, is the inconvenient truth they would prefer we never knew. The price of creating art so viscerally honest and uncompromising is often the artist's own flesh and blood. They left us the music, an eternal monument to their dysfunctional genius, but they were left with the scars. And it is our duty, as discerning listeners and as human beings, to acknowledge and respect both.